My name is Jonathan Anderson, and with me today is Dr. Rachel Hostetter Smith. Just a brief intro of you. Dr. Smith is the Gilkison Professor of Art History at Taylor University in Indiana, and she's also the Vice President of the Association of Scholars of Christianity in the History of Art, or Asha, as it's referred to. It's so good to have you with us.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to begin by asking you about Asha, Association of Scholars in Christianity in the History of Art. Tell me a bit more about that association of scholars. What's the framework? What's the vision for that group?
Yeah, well, in about a decade ago, a number of art historians that were colleagues on a number of different projects began to recognize that there was a gap in platforms for certain kinds of scholarship in art history. And so a number of us began to talk about the need to actually provide a platform for the work that scholars in a lot of different historical periods were doing related to Christianity very specifically, religion a little bit more broadly, in the history of art. We initially started by launching a symposium that was held in Paris in the summer of 2010 just to gauge interest, and had a broad topic on art history and rupture in contemporary art, and wanted to see what that might lead to. We had a terrific response, a great symposium that also included conversations with attendees and participants about what we might do to make that kind of a forum more available to scholars who are working on those kinds of topics. And that led to the establishment of the Association of Scholars of Christianity in the History of Art, which is quite a mouthful, but the title of the organization is actually quite carefully constructed to place the emphasis on scholarship, and then scholars who are specifically interested in Christianity, because that seems to be one of the primary areas of little opportunity in certain periods, especially of art criticism and art history, so that the organization is intended to focus on scholarship, not necessarily on anyone's specific faith commitment. And that's what we wanted to emphasize even in the way that we laid the name out. So that led essentially to starting to think about how do we establish those platforms for scholars to come together, to present their scholarship, to engage in vigorous conversation, a kind of open conversation about issues related to Christianity that appear in all kinds of artwork that had really been neglected by the scholarly community, up until that point. So the organization was formally established in 2010, and we've been going strong ever since.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm interested in the gaps that you're seeking to fill or reinvestigate. Yeah. I mean, it strikes me that there would be lots of different ways of investigating the role of Christianity in the history of art, Christianity as just a sociological phenomenon, a backdrop that was formative to artworks and artistic imaginations and so forth. I suppose you could also investigate it as content, not just historical backdrop, but as informing the content or being a subject matter of artworks. Would you say a little bit more about how the association tends to aim its conversations at that, and maybe even say a bit more about those gaps? Where do you see those gaps to be provide the greatest opportunity for reinvestigation?
Yeah, the approach that we've taken is actually to be quite broad and wide-ranging, but also to try to find ways of approaching the topic in fresh and distinct ways, so that we don't want to duplicate what has already been done, or to simply do what is expected to engage those topics in particular historical periods or maybe regional areas where there are standard artists that you know you need to deal with, that type of thing. So we do deal with both that sociological and political and religious backdrop, and allow for that. But we are also really deeply interested in providing opportunities for scholars who have discovered work that artists are doing or have done in the past that has really been ignored. They may be artists who are really well known, but a certain portion of their work has been ignored by the scholarly or critical community because they don't think that it is relevant to the current discussions, about art or in intellectual circles. So in a general way, that's the approach that we take, and are always looking at both identifying topics for symposia that we undertake, and then the submissions that we receive from scholars. How can we put those together in a fresh way that enlarges and enriches the conversation that might take place and moves beyond anything that has already taken place?
Off the top of your head, do you have a couple examples where you think the organization has really produced some significant rereading of artists we might be familiar with, or artworks that have been neglected? I know there's a lot, but maybe one or two.
And we've actually, in the few years that we've been in existence, just a little over 6 years, we've hosted 7 symposia. We've also had quite a number of publications, books, as well as substantial journal publications that have arisen out of the symposia in many instances. So it's hard to kind of walk back through each of those on the spot, but I'll refer to a couple of specific events and then what arose out of them, and ones that I've been a little bit more directly involved in shaping. One of those actually took place here in LA. It was held at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in downtown LA. And that actually reflects one of the significant aspects of Asha's core values and strategies, so to speak. We really try to find significant partners to work with on each of our events. And so finding an institution that will host our event is significant for connecting with the larger community, and again, furthering interest in this kind of scholarship. So that particular symposium was focused on Christianity and Latin American art, which on the surface would not necessarily be something that wouldn't have some opportunities available for scholars dealing with Christianity, because the history of Catholicism is so important to the Latin American story, so to speak, and even to people who are Latino anywhere in the world today. That tends to be a part of the backdrop of their culture and their way of thinking about things. But we wanted to try to move the conversation in directions that were a little bit different than what most of the scholarship was, that was being highlighted and brought into view up until that point. And so one of the distinctive things that we did was we actually received a number of submissions from people who were practicing artists rather than actual scholars. And this is another aspect of Asha's openness and trying to stretch the conversation, even though it is an organization for scholarship and primarily for scholars. We realize that there are people outside of art history who can bring into view significant aspects of understanding of artistic practice and interpretation that aren't always brought into a scholarly discussion. So we included, both in the symposium and then in the journal issue, which was the equivalent of the length of a book, that was published as a result of it. Several artists who were, in one case, talking about her own work, and her work dealing with grave monuments in Colorado, and the Latino people groups, that have settled in that area, that gave a very different view of how to think about memorialization, about aspects of folk art practice from an artist's perspective. That was really quite enriching. We also wanted to include, in this particular project, quite a historical scope to see what would emerge from that engagement, because very often scholarly conversations are really narrow in their focus. So you might deal with Renaissance Latin American art, which would be focused on a single century or two of endeavor. And that brings certain kinds of things into view without a doubt, and a level of depth of understanding of that arena. But we wanted to see what would emerge by having artists working over a longer period of stretch of history, to come together and have a shared conversation. So we included presentations that stretched from the earliest settlements in Latin America by European Catholics originally, up until absolutely contemporary work that really allowed us to see the development and also certain kinds of issues that continued to crop up over time, which was really interesting.
Yeah, I was at that conference and found it so stimulating because it was a reinvestigation of the role of Christianity, the influence of Christianity in Latin American art. But it included a lot of time periods, as you said, a real diversity of artifacts, including artworks, all the way to folk art, grave monuments, those sorts of things. But also included people coming from a variety of different backgrounds and faith commitments. And that's, I think, an important part of what you're doing is that it's this isn't about kind of making an apologetic for Christianity per se, but rereading it and its role in art history. And that does get at, I think, one of the real challenges in contemporary writing of art history is that for a variety of reasons, religious thought and practice has been kind of absent or invisible or at least underdeveloped in the writing of art history, where you get really good formalist accounts, really good political, social accounts, and then the sort of, well, what about the religious backdrop or the religious difficulties or struggles of this or that artist? And I think that your association is doing wonderful work in that respect, just rereading some of the history, reevaluating a good portion of it. I mean, so you're trying to work on that rereading. What do you see as encouraging developments in that respect? Do you feel like this is a burgeoning field of study? Is there a return of religion to art history?
That's actually a great question. And one of the things that has been really exciting for us to see, those of us who established Asha as an organization, is to see the kind of response, to see the number and range of people who have, in a sense, come out of the woodwork as we have put out calls for proposals to to present a paper at a symposium, or when we've solicited proposals to expand contributions to a particular publication, where we are receiving submissions from well-established historians who had been working on something, but there was no venue either for presentation or publication for this particular aspect of work that they had been doing on a particular artist or artwork. And then we're also seeing a lot of young scholars who are interested in issues of spirituality and meaning, may not necessarily have a personal faith commitment, and Asha does not in any way expect or presume that in anything that we do. What we're looking for is scholarship that takes religion and religious sensibilities and Christianity seriously, regardless of their faith commitment, their personal faith commitment, and is going to investigate it, with that kind of integrity, and that's what we're really looking for, and so we're seeing scholars of all stripes from some of the most prestigious institutions, in the country, who have been working on these things, who are coming to our events, contributing to them in a variety of ways, because it provides that forum for this aspect of their work.
There's a remarkable hospitality about that,
Yeah.
and to the discussion. Certainly my experience with your group
Yeah.
has been
Yeah.
it's a hospitable
Yeah, and
table setting.
that's another, in a sense, hallmark or core value about the way that we undertake what we do. One of the other things that those of us who helped to establish Asha had recognized in academia in general and in academic forums was that there often tended to be a lack of hospitality and a sense of careerism and competition rather than the primary mood being interest in genuine engagement in interaction with ideas and scholarship to see what you could learn from one another and where it could go. And so we wanted to change that, even in a small way, to really set the stage for welcome and appreciation for whatever work scholars were doing, whether it was harshly critical of Christianity and the role that it may have played. We are not in any way filtering those kinds of perceptions, as well as those who may be more naturally inclined to embrace some of those the tenets of Christianity from a more personal standpoint. So we try to extend that sense of hospitality both in very concrete ways to scholars, as well as simply seeking to facilitate the conversation and engagement in more subtle kinds of ways as we're actually engaging in the events and in developing the publications. But one of the things that we do is we work really hard at curating whatever we do, whether it's the arc within a particular event, thinking very, very carefully, why do we want a certain paper to be the first one that's presented, and how is that going to allow for a certain kind of conversation to build throughout the program of the event to make that conversation emerge as naturally as possible.
Well, and speaking of hospitality and shifting gears just a bit, one of the other projects that you've really spent a lot of time on and have really been doing a lot of work on, it is a hosting of seminars devoted to international contemporary art making, in which you're bringing North American artists into more direct contact with contemporary artists, contemporary art making in Global South. Specifically, you've hosted seminars in Indonesia, in South Africa, and there's a coming one planned for China. I'm interested in what you're up to in those seminars, why those particular locations, and what's interesting to you, what is drawing you to this sort of cross-cultural, international sort of, and the location of those seminars.
Yeah. Well, my involvement in these initiatives goes back to about 2007, when I was approached by the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity, which is based at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where they were about to launch a new series of college faculty development seminars. And interestingly enough, oddly enough, most people would say, the first one was intended to focus on the visual arts. Most people in the visual arts would say we're the last to be considered as significant to what's going on, especially in Christian circles. But the funders, the seed funders for this new initiative had a very distinctive interest in the visual arts, and so they said, we want the first seminar to be about the visual arts. And because I had some background in Asian art, and they were also interested in it being somewhere in Asia, I was approached to help to develop that first seminar. And so we investigated, where might be a good location, and for a variety of reasons we settled on Indonesia, which may seem like an unusual first choice. But Indonesia is actually a place where so many of the issues that are confronting us in the contemporary world are actually present in a very, very significant way. It's the fourth largest country in the world in terms of population. It has the geographical spread of the United States in terms of the extent of where the islands are situated. It's incredibly diverse, and those diverse populations tend to maintain their distinctiveness because it's an island nation. As a result, it also has a wide range of religious differences and populations, from Hindu to Buddhist, a small Christian population, but it also has the largest Muslim population of any country in the world today. And that and many other kinds of issues seemed to suggest that it was a good place to consider. With more investigation, discovering the incredibly rich cultural and artistic legacy of all of these different populations, as well as things like the European colonial past that had tremendous effects on current issues and developments, really clinched the decision that might be a good site. There's also an organization of Asian Christian artists that is one of the oldest Christian arts organizations in the world, that was a good resource for us in certain respects. And those people who are watching the contemporary art world in different regions would also recognize that Indonesia has a thriving contemporary art practice. So we decided that it was a great place to investigate a wide range of issues through art, both historically and in contemporary practice there. One of the distinctives of these seminars is, as you already mentioned, to bring together a group of North American-based art faculty, teaching in higher education institutions with their counterparts as practicing artists in another part of the world. They're not seminars that are just a group of North Americans going and meeting with people there, but they're actually participating with their counterparts, living together for a 2-week period, traveling together, meeting with all kinds of people, visiting sites together, engaged in a common conversation, and getting to know one another both as artists and as people, and also as people who share a Christian foundation with one another. So it's a very intentional, immersive experience for the participants, both on the North American side as well as whatever region of the world that we're basing the seminar in. Another distinctive component of the design of these projects is that those people who submit an application to be a participant agree from the outset that if they're allowed to, if they're selected as one of the participants, that they will commit to contributing to some sort of product or outcome. In this instance, as artists, the product was contributing artwork to an exhibition that then would travel, that would be an outgrowth of that shared experience and whatever new knowledge, so to speak, and insights and questions emerged from that engagement. What was important about that aspect of the design of these seminars is that the participants came into the experience with a kind of active stance rather than a passive stance. They couldn't just be receptors or receivers of the experience, but they knew that something needed to come from it. And that meant that they moved into a mode of active engagement with people, with the issues, with each other, and started thinking about the implications for what this might mean for their own art practice from the outset. The result was, amazing artwork that then traveled in the instance of that first seminar to 10 different venues around the United States and to Canada, with a great deal of programming that, again, worked to actively engage audiences with the artwork and with the issues that the artwork addressed. The other seminars, that initial seminar on the visual arts was so successful from the perception of the donors and the supporting institutions that very early on they said, we need to do more of this. This art business actually has a capacity to engage people with issues in a way that a volume of scholarly essays typically does not. It reaches a broader audience. We estimated that 10,000 people saw that exhibition and came to the events that were hosted in conjunction with it. So the reach of that project was enormous just through the exhibit itself. And so they asked, where else might you go? And so I was asked to begin to investigate that, and really without having to give it a lot of thought, my first two sites were South Africa and China. And I initially did a lot of attempts. I made a lot of forays into investigating South Africa, and it appeared that those doors were not opening. So I had thought that the next seminar would be China because I had contacts there. But then all of a sudden, the doors started to fly open, actually through the development of Asha, that first seminar that took place in Paris. I met a South African art historian who came all the way to Paris for that event, not as a presenter, but just as a participant. And she began to tell me about some of the revival of interest in Christian imagery and artists who were using Christian symbols and references in their art, not necessarily specifically to deal with religious issues per se, but to comment on social and political concerns that they had about the past and the present in South Africa. And through that single contact, I began to make trips to South Africa and discovered, again, an incredibly rich context for dealing with issues that are relevant in virtually any part of the world today. Issues of how do we deal with disputed histories and painful histories, how do we heal from them, and move into a different future that the artists were engaging and furthering in very significant kinds of ways. And that's how we decided that South Africa was the next site.
Well, and it strikes me that the way you've organized these seminars and then the exhibitions that come out of them, they do so many things at once. I mean, on the one hand, you're creating a space for listening, people to listen and try to understand one another. North Americans and Africans in this case, trying to learn from one another, understand one another, and in some sense, all of them feel a bit thrown out of place in the context of South Africa and the sort of enormous political and religious conflicts and struggles that are still going on there. And that creates a really remarkable conversation, a remarkable experience that then gives way to these artworks. But then those artworks start doing something else other than that as they travel through, mostly North America, as they travel through North America, in different locations, providing occasions for conversations about religion and politics and injustice within an American context and in different locations around America, North America. And that's really interesting that it's the way that this project is it's becoming very generative, giving way to conversations that you may or may not have even foreseen happening. I mean, was that intentional from the beginning? One thing that gives way to another thing.
It was a hope and an anticipated likelihood, because in my experience, art provides the potential for difficult conversations and rich conversations to take place. One of the things that these projects has really confirmed is that art, in a sense, can provide a safe intermediary for conversations to take place that would be very difficult to have if you sat two groups or two people across a table from one another and said, we want to talk about Islam and Christianity and the tensions between these two people groups in Indonesia and the violence that has occurred between you there, or in South Africa or in the United States to sit, two groups and talk about their racial kinds of histories. But through the artwork, it neutralizes the conversation so that people can actually talk more honestly and more openly without it seeming to be a personal attack. And it allows for the establishment of trust and a tone to the conversation that also seems to allow people to begin to hear one another and to be willing to look at realities and truths that and their implications that they may not have wanted to look at before. One of the things that was so fascinating to me about South Africa as I dug in to really learn as much as I could about South Africa in working on developing the seminar there was how South Africa's history resonated with different aspects of American and North American history in general. What would seem obvious to most Americans would be that there would be connections with African American history and the relations between African Americans and non-African Americans in the United States. But what I found to be especially interesting was that there were more direct parallels actually between what occurred in South Africa with what occurred in North America between the Native American peoples and the European settlers. Something that was often relatively invisible, even to me. My experience in South Africa was, in a sense, a personal kind of epiphany about how little I knew about Native American history and experience, because it's a minority population here in the United States and in most parts of North America, in Canada as well, and where the Native American populations tend to be concentrated in certain parts of the country. So if you don't live in the Southwest or Wyoming, you may never encounter anything that reminds you of that history. In South Africa, the population proportions are reversed. The settlers were the minority population and continue to be today, where the white population is approximately 10% of the South African population. 80% is Black African, and then the other 10% are mixed race or Southeast Asians. And so in South Africa, the issues of those who were in power, the people that gained a position of power was actually the minority population of the European settlers over the majority population, and held that for many, many decades until 1990, when apartheid was finally repealed. In the United States, we've been able to largely ignore our history with the Native American peoples, except for very isolated groups who live in those areas, or are specifically in positions that are addressing issues related to Native American peoples, because the rest of us are in the majority, so to speak. And yet the experiences were largely the same in terms of being separated from the settling population that came from Europe for the most part. And then the effects that had on those populations were also very similar, eerily similar. So wanting to bring those kinds of issues and the need for greater awareness into view for those of us in North America was one of the things that I hoped would come. And indeed it has. As we were in South Africa, many of the North Americans began to realize, or we would gently try to prompt consideration of those kinds of questions as we were learning about South African history and contemporary realities. So while there have definitely been, back to your original question, was that intentional? It was a hope. It became more of an expected likelihood. And it has certainly become a reality in how these projects have, in a sense, been put to work. The exhibition has been put to work in all of the venues that it has traveled to so far.
Yeah. I mean, in our own experience here at Biola, when the exhibition was here, it really did cultivate a wonderful and important conversation. It just has the ability, South Africa has the ability, and those who participated in that seminar just come back with different sensitivities, and once those sensitivities are start getting vocalized in an American context, you can't help but see images of yourself in the South African context. And so it's been, just speaking locally, it's been very productive here, very important here.
Great.
So thank you for your good work.
Yeah, it's always really wonderful to me as the curator and project director to hear that kind of a report, because that is exactly what we're hoping for in a very real way. We want the artwork to actually have an impact, and for art to be able to do its real work of speaking to people's minds and hearts, even in ways that they may not realize at the time, prompting questions and possibilities that they hadn't considered before.
And that's one of the wonderful things about art. They are such dense, as objects, they're such dense texts in a way that they are read and reread in different contexts, and they just do different things in different contexts. And that's something not to be resisted, but actually to be embraced. And it certainly has been worthwhile embracing that here.
Yeah. Well, we often, those of us who are art historians and art critics, we like to say that art shows rather than tells. And that means that you have to engage it in a different way. To think that art is typically propositional is to miss the point. It's working in quite a different way, which means that it typically does have these multivalent possibilities in terms of what it is trying to reveal and what it might prompt in any particular person or group that is engaging that particular work or body of work.
Well, I know that for me and for a lot of artists I know, the impulse towards art making does not come from wanting to say something, assert something, as much as it comes from open questions and sort of not always problems, but occasions in which our object of thought is not fully graspable. That's actually what drives you into the art making, is the openness of I don't understand this, I don't know how this fits together, I don't know. And so the art making is an exploration, a working out of those things. And that's one of the things that makes them dense and rereadable. And to connect that back to where we started this discussion, that's one of the things that makes your project in Asha so compelling, is that part of the density of the art making, the openness, includes religious backgrounds and theological questions and openness that can be profitably read and reread, reinterpreted. I think that's one of the things you're doing well in Asha.
Yeah, and one of the things that anyone who spends a lot of time with artists or is an artist himself or herself realizes is that, as you said, art is a means of investigation or a way of knowing. And what gets created has a kind of life of its own. And so it's almost like a living person that when it's sent out into the world after the artist has created it, people who encounter that work are going to enter into their own conversation with that thing that has been created. And it will lead often in new directions, sometimes that the artist himself or herself didn't anticipate. And sometimes there's a three-way conversation that's taking place between the person looking at the art, the artwork, and the artist's own sense of what the work is. But recognizing that capacity for artworks to continue to speak and to speak in new and fresh ways, even beyond the original context out of which it was produced, is one of the really wonderful aspects of art, and especially, art that is worth going back to over and over again.